Human denied entry by alien officer. Then he saves her life. Jake Mercer's boots hit the cracked pavement with a heavy thud as he walked toward the looming checkpoint, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The city of Taris stretched before him, a sprawling maze of metallic towers, shimmering in the light of the twin suns above. The landscape was a strange mix of beauty and decay, with towering skyscrapers rising like gleaming monoliths while the lower levels of the city lay buried under years of industrial grime. It looked like a puzzle, Jake thought, with the central district a flawless masterpiece at its heart, and the outskirts a place where the underworld thrived. He tugged the collar of his military jacket, adjusting it for the umpteenth time, though the patches from his service days were still visible, no matter how much he tried to hide them. It was the sort of place where your past could follow you if you weren't careful, and for Jake Mercer, the past was a lot to carry. But today, he wasn't here to worry about old scars. Today, he was here for a mission, something far more important than whatever personal baggage the city might dredge up. The duffel bag across his shoulder was filled with medical supplies, packed and labeled for the Central District Hospital. He was here to help, to deliver what they needed most, supplies for children, orphans from the Vorga conflict, kids who had been left to die in the ruins of a war, and Jake had made it his life's work to make sure they didn't. Jake's fingers tightened around the straps of his bag as he approached the checkpoint. The building loomed ahead, sleek and curved, with glowing blue force fields humming softly at the entrance, a stark contrast to the dirty streets behind him. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the security station. Taris was known for being selective when it came to outsiders, and humans were never treated as anything more than second-class citizens. He had prepared for this. He'd done his homework. But that didn't make it any easier. A few steps away, standing like a silent sentinel, was the border officer, a tall, alien woman, her silver-white hair pulled back in a severe style. Her face was sharp, angular, with piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through him. The deep blue of her skin shimmered slightly under the artificial lights. Her posture was perfect, rigid, almost like she was made of stone. "Identification and purpose of visit," she demanded, her voice cold and professional. Her gaze never wavered, never softened, as she scanned him with suspicion. Jake forced himself to stand tall, to look her in the eye. "Jake Mercer, Earth citizen," he said, pulling his interplanetary ID from his jacket pocket and sliding it across the counter. "I'm here to deliver medical supplies to Central District Hospital." She didn't even glance at the ID right away, her fingers moving swiftly over the console. "The Central District?" she repeated. "You require special clearance to access that area." Jake felt his jaw tighten, his patience beginning to fray. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped at a border like this. Not even close. "I have authorization from Dr. Rennick," he said, his voice steady but firm. "These supplies are for the children's ward. They're treating orphans from the Proxima conflict." The officer, whose name tag read Naira, looked at the data chip Jake handed her, her sharp eyes scanning it with little interest. "This authorization is insufficient," she said after a moment, tapping a few commands into the console. "It requires a Level 3 clearance stamp from the Central Administration." Jake's fists clenched inside his jacket pockets. He had expected this. The bureaucratic wall that seemed specifically designed to block humans from entering their precious inner rings. It was a familiar roadblock, one he'd run into countless times in his career. But this was different. These kids were dying. They didn't have time for red tape. His voice remained calm, though the anger simmered just beneath the surface. "Look, Officer Naira, these supplies are time-sensitive. There are kids who need this medicine now. You cannot proceed without proper clearance." Naira interrupted, her tone colder than before. Her fingers tapped her console with mechanical precision. "Perhaps you should have secured proper documentation before attempting to enter a restricted zone." Jake was ready to argue further, but something about her tone, the way she spoke about humans like they were an inconvenience, set him off. He gritted his teeth, trying to keep his temper in check. "Those kids deserve better than this," he said quietly, his frustration leaking through. For a split second, something flickered across Naira's face. Doubt? Regret? Jake wasn't sure, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the unyielding professionalism she wore like armor. "Next visitor," she said flatly, waving him away. The interaction was over. Jake stood there for a moment, his heart racing. His thoughts swirled as he stepped back from the station. The supplies in his bag weighed heavier with every step he took away from the checkpoint. He'd known it wouldn't be easy, but he didn't expect it to feel like this. He turned his back to the officer and walked away, his mind already racing through other options. There had to be another way in. The black market could get him into the Central District, but it would cost a fortune. And time was something he didn't have. But just as he reached the exit, the entire building shuddered, a deafening roar rattling the walls. Jake whipped around just in time to see the ceiling above him collapse, sending chunks of debris crashing to the floor. Screams filled the air as people ran for cover, scattering in all directions. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion, the dust cloud rising in thick waves. Jake's heart stopped. His eyes locked on Naira's station, where the officer had just been standing. It was buried under a pile of rubble. Without thinking, Jake sprinted back toward the chaos, ignoring the other security personnel shouting at the panicked crowd. "Get out! Evacuate now," they yelled. But Jake wasn't listening. He had to go back. He couldn't leave her behind. He reached the wreckage of Naira's station, the building groaning and cracking under its own weight. He pushed through the dust and debris, ignoring the stinging cuts on his hands as he cleared the twisted metal and concrete. "Officer Naira," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Can you hear me?" A faint groan answered him from beneath a heavy beam. Jake gritted his teeth and used every last ounce of strength to lift it, his muscles straining under the pressure. The beam moved just enough for him to see a flash of blue skin. With a final push, he pulled it off her, revealing Naira, bruised but alive. Her silver-white hair was matted with blood, and her green eyes fluttered open. "Talk later," Jake grunted, lifting her into his arms. "This place is coming down." The dust still hung in the air like a thick fog, stinging Jake's eyes as he hoisted Officer Naira, her limp form pressing against his chest. The crumbling structure groaned beneath them, threatening to collapse entirely with each passing second. He gritted his teeth, adrenaline pushing him forward as he navigated through the wreckage. His military training kicked in, guiding his movements with precision, though his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. Keep moving. Keep moving," Jake muttered to himself, as much to focus his mind as to encourage Naira, who had yet to regain full consciousness. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Naira's station, once a well-organized beacon of bureaucratic control, was now a twisted mass of steel and concrete. Screams echoed through the building as panicked civilians rushed for exits, but Jake couldn't afford to waste time with them. His only focus was getting Naira out, even though she had just been the one standing in his way moments ago. Despite the chaos, something strange stirred inside him. There was an odd sense of responsibility as he carried her, an unfamiliar bond starting to form. He didn't know her, didn't particularly like her. Yet here he was, carrying her through the rubble of a collapsing building like some kind of hero in a forgotten story. It didn't make sense, and yet it felt right. "Stay with me," he urged, glancing down at her, still disoriented in his arms. The blue glow of her skin had faded to an ashen tint, and the blood from her forehead wound matted her hair. Her silver-white locks, once meticulously styled, now hung limply over her face. "Jake!" Naira's voice was weak, almost lost under the weight of the falling debris, but it was enough to make Jake slow his pace for a brief moment. She struggled to lift her hand, reaching for his chest where her fingers brushed against his jacket. The faintest flicker of recognition passed in her eyes. "You're alive," she rasped, her voice a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "Yeah, lucky for you," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice light even though the pressure on his lungs was unbearable. "I didn't think I'd be rescuing anyone today." She managed a weak smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. The building shook again, and Jake had no choice but to hurry her through the debris-filled corridors. The sound of collapsing walls and the scream of twisting metal was growing louder with each passing moment. The whole place felt like it was about to fall apart at any second. "Why didn't you just let me go?" Naira muttered, her voice soft but edged with something like regret. "I would have been one less problem for you." Jake didn't have an answer for that, at least not one that made sense. The truth was, as much as he resented her cold, dismissive attitude, he couldn't leave her to die here. Not when he could do something about it. Maybe it was the part of him that still believed in doing the right thing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because he couldn't stand the idea of leaving someone behind. Not when he knew better. "Shut up," Jake muttered, his jaw set as he moved faster. "You'll make it out of here. We both will." The hallway ahead was a mess of overturned furniture, destroyed walls, and sparks flying from damaged electrical panels. Every step felt like it could be their last, but Jake didn't slow down. His grip on Naira tightened as he pushed through the wreckage. The outside world, the real world, where he could get these supplies to the children, felt miles away, but it was still there, waiting for him. Finally, they reached the outer edge of the checkpoint, where the emergency exit led them to the open air. The harsh sunlight hit Jake like a slap in the face, his eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. As he set Naira down gently against a large metal crate, he took a moment to look around. The scene was utter chaos. A handful of survivors were huddled together, some with injuries, others in shock, all of them staring at the destruction they had just escaped from. Emergency responders were arriving, but they were too few, too late. The damage had already been done. "Can you stand?" Jake asked, looking down at Naira, who had slumped against the crate, still dazed. Her green eyes met his, and for the first time since they had met, they were filled with something other than cold indifference. I think so," Naira replied, her voice shaky. She tried to push herself upright, but winced in pain. The wound on her forehead had bled a little more, and she swayed slightly before steadying herself. Jake's hand instinctively went to her shoulder, holding her steady. "You need medical attention," Jake said, his voice softer now. He wasn't sure where this concern for her was coming from, but it was there, and it was stronger than the anger that had been building inside him since he'd arrived. "I'll survive," Naira replied, her lips curling into a faint but determined smile. "I've been through worse." Jake couldn't help but shake his head. "If you say so, but you'll need more than just grit to get through this." He scanned the area, spotting a few of the emergency responders moving toward the rubble, but he wasn't going to wait for them. He wasn't going to leave Naira to someone else's care. Not after everything that had happened. He bent down and grabbed the duffel bag filled with supplies, pulling it over his shoulder. Naira's eyes followed the bag, her expression turning thoughtful. "You still think you can deliver those supplies?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the distant sound of sirens. "After all this?" Jake didn't answer immediately. His gaze hardened as he thought about the children, the ones who had no one else to turn to. The ones who were waiting on the other side of the city. They needed him. They needed these supplies. "Yeah," he said finally, his jaw set. "I can. I'm not giving up on them." Her expression softened, and for the briefest moment, he could see something else in her eyes. It was the barest flicker of respect, mixed with a touch of something deeper. For the first time, Naira wasn't just the cold officer who had shut him out at the checkpoint. She was a person who had been saved, and who had witnessed the unwavering resolve that had driven him into danger without hesitation. "You really are different," she said quietly, as if to herself. Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the moment between them, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for that. The only thing that mattered now was getting those supplies where they needed to go, and keeping Naira, and himself, alive long enough to do it. "Let's go," he said, his voice resolute as he helped her to her feet. The journey ahead was uncertain, dangerous, but Jake was used to that. And with Naira by his side, maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at changing things. The harsh sun beat down on them as Jake and Naira moved through the wreckage-strewn streets of Taris. The chaos of the explosion still echoed in the distance, but the immediate danger had passed. The distant hum of hovercrafts and the faint wail of sirens filled the air, blending with the soft groans of the city's crumbling infrastructure. Dust still clung to everything, a reminder of how fragile their surroundings were. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, his pace quick but steady. Naira was walking beside him now, though her steps were slower than usual. He noticed the way her jaw clenched every time her injured side twinged, but she wasn't slowing down, and that told him all he needed to know. She wasn't one to back down easily, even when her body begged for rest. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice raspy, betraying her exhaustion. Jake didn't look at her immediately, his attention focused on the horizon. "To the underground tunnels," he replied, his voice clipped with purpose. "They're the quickest way to the central district without running into any more trouble." The thought of the tunnels made Naira tense. They were a maze of old service routes beneath the city, once used for maintenance and repairs, now largely forgotten by the residents above. The government had shut them down decades ago, and the only people who ventured into them now were those who had no choice. She knew they were dangerous, unpredictable, but Jake's tone left little room for argument. "Sounds safe," she muttered, though she didn't sound convinced. "It'll have to be," Jake replied, his voice as cold and direct as the streets around them. Their destination was still several kilometers away, and the journey felt like a race against time. Every second counted now, with the explosion causing a citywide panic and security tightening around the more prominent areas. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Tari's wasn't known for its leniency toward outsiders, and if they got caught trying to bypass security, it wouldn't just be their lives on the line. It would be the lives of the children who were depending on Jake to get them their supplies. As they moved forward, Naira's eyes flicked from side to side, her military training kicking in. She scanned the street ahead, keeping a lookout for any sign of danger. Every alleyway, every corner was a potential trap, and with the way Tari's had treated Jake, his presence unwelcome, it wouldn't be surprising if the authorities were already on high alert, looking for any excuse to stop them. "What happened back there?" Naira asked suddenly, her voice cutting through Jake's thoughts. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "The explosion. Why did you come back for me?" Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no mask in her gaze, no officer, no border security agent. Just a person, asking a question that had been on her mind since he'd risked everything to save her. Jake stopped walking for a moment, letting the noise of the city fill the space between them. The question hung in the air, but he didn't answer right away. He wasn't even sure why he'd come back. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't want to examine too closely. "I don't leave people behind," Jake said finally, his voice low. "Not if I can help it." Naira didn't say anything for a moment. She seemed to absorb his words, her eyes flickering with something akin to surprise. It was clear that she hadn't expected that answer. "You're different from the others," she said quietly, almost as if to herself. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he started walking again, picking up the pace. The sooner they reached the tunnels, the sooner he could get Naira the medical help she needed, and the sooner he could finish his mission. But something in Naira's words stayed with him, pulling at the edges of his thoughts. Different from the others. What did that mean? What did she mean? They reached the entrance to the tunnels just as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the city. The entrance was hidden behind a stack of rusted crates, an area most people avoided. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a storage area, a forgotten part of the city left to rot. But Jake knew better. The tunnels beneath the city were still used, though mostly by those who had no other choice. Naira hesitated before stepping forward, clearly uneasy about what lay below. She glanced at Jake, her face momentarily showing the cracks in her usually flawless exterior. "How long has it been since you've been down here?" she asked, her voice wary. Jake gave a half-smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Too long." He led her to a small hatch in the ground, hidden beneath the crates. The rusted metal creaked as he pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow passage below. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old stone and decay. Jake dropped down into the darkness first, offering his hand to Naira as she followed. She hesitated only for a moment before taking it, her grip firm but cautious. The moment she was on the ground beside him, Jake shut the hatch behind them, sealing them off from the world above. The tunnels were pitch black, and Jake relied on his military-grade flashlight to guide them through the winding passageways. The faint hum of the city above them was muffled, but the silence of the tunnels was almost deafening. There was something unsettling about being underground, away from the light, away from the safety of the world they knew. But there was no going back now. "This is your plan?" Naira's voice broke the silence, a hint of disbelief in her tone. "You're really going to take us through these?" Jake shrugged, his eyes scanning the dark corridor ahead of them. "Best option we have." They moved deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. With every turn, every step further into the darkness, Jake could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Time was running out. But despite the gravity of the situation, despite the danger they were in, He couldn't help but notice the way Naira's presence seemed to steady him. She was no longer just the cold border officer who had denied him entry. She was someone who had, in the strangest of ways, become a part of his fight to deliver the supplies to the children who were depending on him. "You don't trust me, do you?" Naira's voice cut through his thoughts again, this time with a sharpness that he hadn't expected. Jake didn't look at her. "Trust is earned," he said simply. "It doesn't come easy. Not for people like me." "And people like me?" Naira asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Jake glanced at her finally, his expression unreadable. "I don't know yet." They both fell into silence again, the weight of their unspoken words hanging between them. But in the darkness of the tunnels, something shifted. They were no longer enemies or strangers. They were survivors, two people thrown together by circumstance, bound by a mission neither of them could afford to fail. And as they moved forward, with each step into the unknown, the one thing Jake knew for certain was this. If they were going to make it out of this alive, they'd need to rely on each other more than either of them were ready to admit. But in this broken world, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. And yet, somehow, Jake had a feeling it was the only thing that would see them through. The deeper they went into the tunnels, the colder the air became. The darkness pressed in on them like a thick fog, each step echoing in the narrow passageways. The sound of dripping water and the occasional distant scurrying of unseen creatures filled the silence, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Jake's flashlight cut through the gloom, its beams slicing through the blackness ahead. Naira had fallen into step beside him, her face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She didn't complain, didn't make a sound, but Jake could sense the weight of her thoughts. It was strange. Once, she had been his obstacle, the enemy who stood between him and his goal. Now, she was a part of this mission, an unexpected ally in a world where enemies were made every day. The tunnels twisted and turned, some parts claustrophobic, others wide enough to walk through without brushing the walls. They encountered a few maintenance drones, but they were old, abandoned models with dimming lights, left to rot in the shadows. The real danger wasn't the machines, though. It was the unpredictable nature of the tunnels themselves. Jake stopped for a moment, his senses alert. There was something wrong. The air had changed, and the silence felt heavier. "Listen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Naira froze beside him, her posture tense, her hand instinctively going to the sidearm hidden under her jacket. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked. Naira nodded, her eyes narrowing as she scanned their surroundings. At first, there was nothing. No sound but the faint hum of distant machinery above and the soft shuffle of their footsteps. But then, just as the silence seemed to stretch into something suffocating, they both heard it. A low, rhythmic scraping sound, like claws dragging across the stone floor. "Someone's following us," Naira said, her voice tight. Jake's hand instinctively went to his belt, but the reality of the situation hit him hard. He wasn't armed with anything beyond the medical supplies and the sheer will to complete this mission. They needed to be quiet, to move fast. "Can you see anything?" Jake whispered. Naira shook her head, her eyes scanning the dark, her senses alert. "No, but it's getting closer." Jake didn't need to be told twice. "We move faster," he muttered, taking a step forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. They quickened their pace, but the sound, scraping, scurrying, something following them, grew louder. It was a steady, unnerving rhythm that made Jake's skin crawl. Then, ahead of them, the tunnel split into two directions, one leading left, another right. They had no way of knowing which was safer. "This way," Jake said, pointing to the left. It was a gut instinct, but he had to choose. He didn't know what was following them, but the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that whatever it was would catch up. They turned left and moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the scraping grew louder, faster. It was closing in on them. "We're not going to outrun it," Naira said, glancing over her shoulder. Her voice had lost its usual cold detachment, now tinged with urgency. "Whatever it is, it's getting closer." Jake's mind raced. They needed a way out, a way to confront whatever was following them. But running, especially without knowing what they were up against, felt like a death sentence. "You got a plan?" Naira asked, looking at him, her eyes now sharp with focus. Jake didn't have time to answer. A low growl echoed from the tunnel behind them, cutting through the silence. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't human. "Run!" Jake shouted, and before he could react, Naira was already ahead of him, sprinting down the tunnel with a speed that surprised him. He cursed under his breath, forcing his legs to move faster. The sound of claws scraping against the floor was now joined by a guttural growl, sending chills down his spine. As they rounded a corner, Jake's flashlight flickered, its beam dancing wildly in the dark. He caught a glimpse of something, a shadow moving fast, and too low to the ground. Then, it was gone, swallowed by the tunnel ahead. "What the hell is that thing?" Naira gasped, her breath heavy as she turned to face him. Her normally composed expression was replaced with one of sheer disbelief. "Did you see that?" Jake nodded, adrenaline surging through him. "Yeah, and we need to keep moving. It's hunting us." They ran, the sound of their footsteps slapping against the cold stone floor echoing through the narrow tunnel. The growls grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one creature, they were surrounded. As they ran, the tunnel began to narrow, the walls closing in on them. It was a dead end. The only way out was the way they'd come, but that meant facing whatever was chasing them. Naira looked at Jake, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What now? Jake's mind raced. He was out of options. But then, a flicker of hope. There, at the far end of the tunnel, was an old service door, slightly ajar. It led to another part of the maintenance network, one that wasn't supposed to be on any map. If they could get to it, they might have a chance. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "I'll cover you," Jake said, his voice firm. "No," Naira snapped, her eyes flashing. "We cover each other." Without another word, they ran toward the door, every step feeling like it could be their last. The growls of the creatures behind them were almost deafening now, as if they were closing in from all sides. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, everything felt unreal. He could feel Naira beside him, her presence solid, reassuring in the chaos. They were a team now, whether they liked it or not. Just as they reached the door, something lunged from the shadows, its claws raking across the stone, just inches from Jake's leg. He twisted away, barely managing to avoid the creature's sharp teeth. "Move!" Jake shouted, grabbing Naira's arm and yanking her through the door. They stumbled into another hallway, breathless and wide-eyed, their muscles aching from the frantic sprint. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a moment, there was silence. The creatures, whatever they were, stopped growling, stopped scraping, stopped moving. "We're not out of this yet," Naira said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was something different in her tone now. It wasn't just fear. It was understanding. Jake looked at her, his pulse still racing. "We're not done, no? But for now, we've bought ourselves some time." As they caught their breath in the relative safety of the new tunnel, Jake realized something. He hadn't just saved Naira's life when he pulled her out of the wreckage. In that moment, they had both saved each other. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. The survival of their mission depended on their willingness to trust each other, no matter what. Because in the tunnels beneath Tari's, trust wasn't just a luxury. It was the only thing keeping them alive. The air in the new tunnel was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the skin and weighed down the mind. Jake could still hear the echo of the creature's growls in his head, even though they were no longer pursuing. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, sharp and raw. They had narrowly escaped, but the danger was far from over. Naira leaned against the cold stone wall, her chest heaving with each breath. Her uniform was covered in dust and dirt, the once pristine insignia now barely visible under layers of grime. Despite the obvious exhaustion, her eyes were sharp, alert. She wasn't letting her guard down, not even for a second. Jake didn't take his eyes off the passage ahead. It twisted further into darkness, but there was a faint light at the end. They still had a long way to go before they reached the central district. And now, they were both running on borrowed time. "Do you think we lost them?" Naira asked, her voice low, her hand still gripping the gun at her side, though she had stopped checking over her shoulder every few seconds. Jake didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what he thought. He wasn't convinced they'd truly escaped, but the reality was that they had no choice but to keep moving forward. He was more concerned about what came next, the more pressing issue of getting the supplies to the children. "They're not the only danger down here," he finally said, his voice grim. We need to focus on making it through these tunnels without attracting more attention. We can't afford another encounter like that. Naira nodded, her brow furrowed as she considered his words. The tunnel before them wasn't just a physical obstacle. It was a test of patience, of nerves, and, most importantly, of trust. How much further? She asked, clearly not interested in small talk. They both had bigger problems than their discomfort, and the air was still thick with the weight of unspoken words. Couple more kilometers, Jake said, his voice even. We stay quiet, move fast, and keep our eyes open. The tunnels narrowed further as they went deeper, the walls slick with moisture. The stale air was suffocating, and the only sound was the distant hum of Taris's decaying infrastructure. They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, but it was impossible not to notice the subtle shift between them. There was an unspoken understanding now, an alliance forged by fire. They weren't just allies because they had no choice anymore. They were becoming something more. Jake glanced sideways at Naira. There was something different in the way she carried herself now. She was still the professional officer, still the driven border agent who had once turned him away without hesitation. But there was a vulnerability beneath her rigid posture now. Something human, something raw that he hadn't seen before. You know, he said, breaking the silence. I didn't expect you to survive. Naira looked up at him, her eyes narrowed. Is that so? Jake shrugged, his expression unreadable. It's not that I wanted you to die, he clarified, his voice dry. But you didn't exactly give me a warm welcome back there. She scoffed, though there was no malice behind it. I wasn't exactly trained to be friendly with humans. At least, not in the way you're used to. Jake chuckled, a dry, bitter sound that echoed through the tunnel. You're right about that. They walked in silence for another few moments, the weight of their words hanging between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. Something was changing. Jake couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way they had to depend on each other, or maybe it was the simple fact that they were both trapped in this nightmare of a city, but there was a shift happening between them, subtle and unspoken. Why didn't you just leave me behind? Naira's voice was quieter now, almost introspective. She was looking ahead, her eyes scanning the tunnel, but there was a vulnerability in her tone that she hadn't shown before. Jake was taken aback by the question. He'd thought about it. Of course, he'd been angry, frustrated, and ready to walk away when she'd turned him down at the checkpoint. But now, here they were, surviving together. And there was something about her question that caught him off guard. You were going to die if I left you, he said simply. I don't let that happen. For the first time, Naira actually looked at him, her expression softening. Why? Jake didn't have a ready answer. It wasn't as simple as just saving her life. It was something deeper. Something in him recognized the change in her. They were both shaped by this broken world, by its rules, by the things they had to do to survive. But right now, they were fighting the same fight. I guess I'm just not the kind of guy who lets others die when they don't deserve it, he said finally, his voice lower now, as if he were talking more to himself than to her. Naira's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, as though searching for something. But she didn't say anything more. She simply turned back to the dark passage ahead, her hand instinctively resting on her sidearm once more, though there was a subtle change in her stance, less rigid, more grounded. They moved on, pushing through the narrow passage, the weight of the medical supplies on Jake's back growing heavier with every step. But there was something else weighing on him now. The decision he'd made when he'd pulled Naira from the wreckage had changed the course of their journey. Whether they liked it or not, they were now bound together by more than just necessity. They were a team, one forged by shared danger, trust, and the unspoken understanding that they couldn't afford to fail. And as they reached the end of the passage, where the tunnel widened into a cavernous space, Jake could hear it. The faint hum of machinery, the sound of a place that had been forgotten by most of Taris. The underground complex was coming into view. Here we are, Jake said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. Naira looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering light from his flashlight. This is the way? Jake nodded, his hand steady as he gestured toward the metal doors ahead. It's the only way. They moved forward together, the quiet tension between them now something different, something stronger. Because, in the end, they weren't just fighting for the supplies or for themselves. They were fighting for a future, for a chance at redemption in a world that had already written them off. And together, They would face whatever came next. The cavernous space ahead stretched out like a forgotten world, its walls coated in grime and dust, the scent of old metal and damp earth thick in the air. The hum of machines grew louder as Jake and Naira approached, the faint flicker of industrial lights casting long shadows over rusted pipes and exposed wiring. This was a part of Tari's that no one bothered to acknowledge, an underground relic of a once thriving city, now left to decay beneath the surface. But to Jake, this was the only route left. No turning back. He glanced at Naira, who moved with careful precision at his side, her every step deliberate, despite the exhaustion written on her face. The shift between them was undeniable. She had been a stone wall at the checkpoint, a figure of cold authority. But now, after everything they had survived, there was something unspoken between them, something more human. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was there, etched in the way their eyes met, in the way they no longer just shared the same space, but operated together. How much further? Naira asked, her voice low, her breath shallow but controlled. Jake didn't have an exact answer. The tunnels ahead were twisting, convoluted, full of dead ends and hidden passages, making it nearly impossible to track their progress. All he knew was that the entrance to the service complex was just ahead, and after that, they'd have to hope the supplies made it to the children in time. Not far, Jake replied, keeping his pace steady. We just have to find the maintenance hatch. As they reached the far end of the cavern, they were met by a strange sight. An enormous steel door, heavily reinforced and lined with security codes that flickered faintly on its surface. The kind of door that made it clear this wasn't a place for anyone to wander into by mistake. Jake moved toward it, his hand resting on the edge of his bag, prepared for whatever might be on the other side. The faintest vibration in the air made him pause. The whole structure felt like it was breathing, alive in a way that made Jake uneasy. Something feels off, Naira murmured, her gaze scanning the door and the area around it. Jake didn't disagree. There was a distinct hum coming from behind the door, almost mechanical, rhythmic, but it wasn't like the usual hum of city infrastructure. This one had an eerie, almost sentient quality to it. Something more deliberate, like a machine that had been waiting. We don't have time to sit around, Jake muttered, stepping forward to inspect the security panel. Let's get inside and move. Naira moved beside him, her sharp eyes already scanning the panel's controls. I've seen these before, she said. It's a restricted access door. Requires clearance from one of the higher-ups in the administration to open. Can you bypass it? Jake asked, his tone direct. Naira's gaze flickered briefly to the flashlight in his hand, then back to the panel. I might be able to get us in, but it's going to take a minute. Do it, Jake said, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. We'll cover. As Naira moved closer to the panel, her hands quick and efficient, Jake turned to face the hallway behind them. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long, every creak in the distant pipes sounding like footsteps. The tension in the air felt heavy, suffocating. The creatures from earlier were still a possibility. But even more pressing than that was the thought of the Central District, of what awaited them if they failed. Time was running out. The children needed the medical supplies, and if they didn't get through this door, if they didn't make it in time, there would be no second chances. A soft beep from the security panel interrupted his thoughts. Naira stepped back, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of satisfaction and wariness. We're in. The massive door groaned as it slid open with a metallic screech, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. It wasn't just any maintenance room. The walls were lined with strange, old machines, their surfaces covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, but they still hummed, a low thrum beneath the air. The kind of machinery you expected to see in a research facility, not in an abandoned, forgotten corner of a city. Jake stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the eerie silence of the room. Naira followed closely behind, her every movement deliberate, her sidearm drawn. This isn't just maintenance equipment, Naira said, her voice quiet but sharp. These are prototypes. High-level tech. What the hell is this place? Jake didn't have an answer. He was too focused on the supplies, on the mission, but something was off. He could feel it, like an unseen presence lingering in the shadows. They crossed the room, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust beneath them. Jake reached for a panel along the far wall, pulling open a metal hatch that revealed a small storage space. The supplies they needed were inside, secured in large, industrial-grade containers. Jake exhaled a breath of relief as he grabbed the first box, Naira following suit with the second. "Let's move," he said, already turning toward the exit. But as they turned to leave, a loud clang echoed through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. Naira immediately dropped to a crouch, her eyes darting to the ceiling. Jake's hand went to his holster, his grip tightening on his gun. From the darkness above, something shifted. A shadow moved across the ceiling, too quick to be human. The machinery around them whirred to life, its lights flickering. A faint hiss of steam filled the air, and then a voice, cold, metallic, distorted, came from somewhere above them. "You should not be here." Jake's heart pounded as he scanned the room, searching for the source of the voice. But the shadows hid everything, made everything feel like it was on the edge of his awareness. "Who are you?" Naira called out, her voice steady but edged with caution. "What is this place?" The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air once more, followed by the unmistakable click of heavy machinery powering up. And then, from the far corner of the room, a figure stepped forward, a figure encased in what looked like an armored exosuit. The suit was sleek, alien, and covered in dark, gleaming plates that reflected the dim light. The helmet was featureless, but the voice, though mechanical, was unmistakably human. "You are not authorized," the figure said again, its tone unnervingly calm. Jake's grip tightened around his gun. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved, its steps heavy and deliberate. The whirring of its machinery was loud in the otherwise silent room. Naira's hand went to her sidearm as well. "We're not here to fight," she said, her voice cold but firm. "We just need the supplies." The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering her words. Then, it spoke again, its voice now eerily familiar, but warped by the suit's distortion. "Then you'll leave, and you will forget what you have seen." Jake's mind raced. "Forget what we've seen? What the hell is going on here?" Before either of them could react, the figure lunged forward, its armored suit moving with surprising speed. Instinct took over. Jake raised his gun, firing a warning shot that hit the ground in front of the figure. "I'm not leaving without those supplies." The figure halted, its mechanical gaze seeming to lock onto him through the helmet's dark visor. For a moment, neither side moved, the room thick with tension. Then, the voice spoke again, this time softer, as if resigned. "You are too late." The figure stepped back, its presence looming in the shadows. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice tight with frustration. But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned, moving toward the back of the room, and in the next instant, it vanished into the darkness. Jake and Naira stood frozen, the silence pressing down on them. "Did that just happen?" Naira asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake exhaled sharply. "I don't know, but we've got bigger problems now." They grabbed the supplies and made their way to the exit, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of Jake's mind. Whatever that figure was, whatever this place had been, they had just uncovered something much darker than they had anticipated. And now, more than ever, the stakes were higher. As they made their way deeper into the tunnels, the weight of their mission felt heavier than before. The unknown had just gotten a lot more dangerous. And in a city like Tari's, that meant only one thing. Survival had just become even more uncertain. The further they moved through the winding tunnels beneath Tari's, the heavier the silence grew. Jake could hear the rush of his own heartbeat, the steady thud of his boots against the uneven ground, but that was all. He glanced at Naira. She was silent too, her expression unreadable, but the tension between them was palpable. It wasn't just the weight of the mission anymore. It was something deeper. The unknowns, the dangers that had piled up, had shifted the whole course of their journey. They had the supplies. They had made it past the mechanical figure that had threatened to end their mission. But there was still the matter of getting through the rest of the city, and then, if they succeeded, getting those supplies to the children in time. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by Naira's voice, low and steady, cutting through the quiet. "You think we'll make it out alive?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered. Jake thought about it for a long moment, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He didn't have an answer. Alive wasn't the right word. Survival wasn't something that could be guaranteed anymore. But they had made it this far. And as long as they kept pushing forward, kept moving, there was still a chance. "We'll make it," he said, more to convince himself than to reassure her. His tone was firm, but the uncertainty lingered, just beneath the surface. "We have to." Naira's lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't argue. The truth was, she didn't want to admit how uncertain she was either. Everything they had done, every step they had taken, had led to this point, and there was no turning back. They continued on in silence, the dim glow of Jake's flashlight guiding them through the dark. As they neared another junction in the tunnels, Jake's senses flared. He stopped, holding up a hand. Naira froze beside him, her eyes darting toward him, silently asking what was wrong. Jake's breath slowed, his pulse quickening. He could hear something, a faint hum, a sound too familiar. Something mechanical. He turned to Naira, his expression grim. "We're not alone." Naira didn't need to ask how he knew. She had heard it too. The air around them seemed to thicken, and Jake's hand instinctively went to his weapon. The faintest echo of footsteps reached their ears, distant but unmistakable. Then, the unmistakable sound of doors sliding open echoed from ahead. They were being watched, maybe even trapped. The sound was too precise, too controlled to be random. "We need to move," Jake said, urgency creeping into his voice. But before they could react, a voice rang out through the darkness, loud and unervingly calm. "You've come too far, Earthborn." The voice was like the one they had heard earlier, the distorted, mechanical tone, but this time, there was something else to it. It was more refined, less robotic. Human, almost. Jake's eyes flicked to Naira, who was already tense, her hand hovering near her sidearm. The voice came from the shadows, from a place that was difficult to pinpoint. A figure stepped out from the dark, more human than the last. Its armor was sleeker, more streamlined. Its presence was imposing, but there was no mistaking it. This was someone who had control, someone in charge. "You were warned," the figure said again, its voice a mixture of authority and indifference. It stepped forward, revealing a face hidden behind a visor. The only thing that remained visible were the faint, glowing patterns along the edges of its helmet, like alien markings embedded into the armor. "Why?" Naira demanded, her voice steady but demanding. "Why stop us now? What is it that you're trying to protect?" The figure tilted its head, almost as if considering her question. It paused before speaking again. "You should never have come. You're meddling with forces you can't understand." Jake stepped forward, his jaw set in determination. "We're just trying to save lives. Those kids." The figure cut him off with a sharp motion, raising a hand. "You're not here for them. You're here because you've discovered too much. You think you can change something, but you can't. You'll never change what's been done." Jake's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" There was a long pause before the figure spoke again, its voice colder this time. "The children you're trying to help, they're not the ones in danger. You are." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He stared at the figure, disbelief flooding his mind. "You're lying," he said, his voice hoarse. "Am I?" the figure replied, the words dripping with menace. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." Before Jake could process the full weight of the revelation, a sharp sound cut through the air. The figure's hand rose, and the tunnel doors behind them slid open, revealing a squad of heavily armed soldiers, all wearing the same sleek armor. They were flanked by several robotic drones, their eyes glowing a piercing red. Jake's grip tightened on his gun, but Naira stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "What are you going to do? Kill us?" The figure stood still for a moment, and when it spoke again, its voice was almost apologetic. "Not kill you, but I am going to stop you. Because this goes beyond your understanding." Jake's mind raced. What was this? Who were these people, and why were they trying so hard to stop him? "We can still make it out of here," Naira said quietly, her voice surprisingly calm. "We can still get those supplies to the children." The figure laughed, short, bitter. "You're too late. The children, they are just pawns. They were never meant to be saved. The truth about this world has already been decided." Jake took a step toward the figure, his fist clenched. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice low and unwavering. Without another word, he raised his gun and fired a warning shot. The sound of the gunshot reverberated through the tunnel, followed by the sound of Naira moving quickly to his side. The soldiers raised their weapons, But the distraction was enough for Jake and Naira to break into motion. They bolted, weaving through the soldiers and dodging the incoming fire. The tunnel became a blur, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind them. Jake could hear the soldiers shouting, but the fear that had gripped him earlier was replaced by something else now. A rush of adrenaline and the instinct to survive. "Keep moving," Jake shouted, adrenaline pumping through his veins. They couldn't stop. Not now. They reached a junction up ahead, and without pausing to think, they veered left. The soldiers' pursuit was relentless, but they were faster, fueled by desperation. The narrow tunnels seemed to stretch on forever, but they kept moving, driven by the hope that they could escape. The hatch they needed was just ahead. Jake reached it first, slamming it open with a force that echoed through the tunnels. He motioned for Naira to follow, and she did without hesitation. As they slid through the hatch, the loud sound of gunfire erupted behind them, but they were already gone, escaping into the relative darkness of the next corridor. Breathing heavily, Jake leaned against the wall, the weight of everything crashing down on him. They had made it, barely, but they were far from done. The city still loomed ahead, its secrets, its dangers, and the uncertain future still ahead. But one thing was clear now. This fight wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for the truth. And whatever they had uncovered beneath Tari's, they were going to expose it. The children might have been pawns in a larger game, but they were not going to let that be the end of it. No, not while they still had a chance.